Hey everybody, I'm Candace Shibley with Utah State University Extension and the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, and you are watching our Water Well with CWEL webinar series.
Great. Hi everyone. I can't see your shining faces, but I am excited to be speaking here today. It's actually quite an honor to be asked. So as Candace said, my name is Shaunie Rasmussen, and I'll be talking to you today about some work that I did in Fort Collins, Colorado. That's where I'm located. And I'll give a little bit of background about myself. So she mentioned I'm a research associate. So I am affiliated with Colorado State University, but I also work for the Denver Urban Field Station. And the Denver Urban Field Station, we call it DUFS. It's part of a larger network of urban field stations throughout the country. So we do a lot of work all along the Front Range. It's not limited to Denver. So I kind of wear a couple hats though. I'm also working this summer as a sprinkler technician for the city of Fort Collins. And with that, I basically go to people's homes and I assess their irrigation systems, try to make sure that they're functioning efficiently. We don't do repairs or anything like that, but just assessments. So that's taking up a lot of my time right now, and I'm really enjoying getting outside with that. I have a master's in ecosystem sustainability from CSU, and I have a bachelor's in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I'm originally from Wisconsin. And so I am a geographer by training. A lot of my work is geospatial, but I tend to focus now mostly on urban areas. Like I said, I guess I could call myself an urban ecologist now. I think I've done enough urban work to earn that title. But I'm really interested in urban ecology because I like that, when the social ecological side of things. I like how bringing people and the environment together. And so my sweet spot that I've been getting into more recently is ecohydrology. So that's ecology and hydrology. It's basically just kind of the intersection between like vegetated cover and water resources. And then I've done a little bit of urban forestry too, but don't call me a forester. I cannot identify many tree species at all. So that's kind of where I am right now at this point in my life. So what I wanted to talk about today, today I'm going to be talking about this paper here. So this was part of my master's thesis, and hopefully there's a little foreshadowing here, but "When Small is Not Beautiful, the Unexpected Impacts of Trees and Parcel Size on Muted Water Use in a Semi-Arid City. I actually wasn't allowed to refer to the city of Fort Collins at all in this paper, which made it kind of fun to write, but it is about Fort Collins. So before I delve into the paper and the work itself, I just wanted to give a little bit, as an urban ecologist, I have to explain how and why we approach cities in the way we do and looking at different patterns on the landscape. So to kind of take a step back, cities are just as much as ecosystems as traditional ecosystems. People, I don't think always think of cities as being ecosystems, but they are. They're unique and they're very complex. So you have this heterogeneous patchwork of all of these different elements, right? So in cities, we study them, they have buildings, they have roads, trees, people, animals, all of these things that interact in very complex ways. And the reason that we study these cities, let me back up actually, is because cities, obviously they're growing rapidly. Urbanization is a huge trend. Most of our global population actually is living in cities. And so I believe, and I think most urban ecologists believe, that cities are just great opportunities to actually see some change and manage resources responsibly and efficiently. And I think that especially mid-size and growing cities, there's a lot of opportunity to kind of step in and really use science, really use our knowledge of social ecological systems to develop accordingly, develop in a responsible and effective manner. So that's kind of why we look at cities. Now, when we are looking at them and we have all of these different components that we look at, ultimately, we're trying to understand how they're interacting to drive different patterns on the landscape. And so in the case of what I'm going to be talking about today, the pattern that we're trying to understand is outdoor water use in Fort Collins. And so cities, like I said, they're really complex and we can't understand all of what's going on, but we can use different, what we call indicator variables to kind of really understand how our city's functioning. And so we have, I mean, it really depends on who you talk to, but generally they're kind of, these variables that I'm talking about are grouped into these 4 categories. We have biophysical and morphological variables in the city, and these really indicate our physical structure and function. The biophysical might be more of those abiotic and biotic components of the city. So like you might have trees, water bodies, grass, things like that. And then when you get into the morphological side of things, this is really reflective of planning and policy and design. So this might be, you know, like building density or how our road networks are arranged. So it's a very important way to understand how we're developing. And then we have social demographic characteristics in cities. I think we all know what that means, whether it be income, educational attainment, race and ethnicity, all of these things that really contribute to our cultural norms and what we see in our cities. And then finally, we look at lifestyle characteristics. And lifestyles, I mean, it's really hard to measure. We don't have a concrete way of measuring people's lifestyles, but we can use, we use marketing data sets to really understand people's purchasing preferences. And it can give a lot of information into people's lifestyles. These social demographic and lifestyles, again, these are kind of the more abstract things. They aren't, like I said, easy to measure, and we don't have them at a household scale for good reason, but we do have them in these kind of neighborhood level scales. And so I wanted to give an example of some of the lifestyles that we looked at particularly in Fort Collins. This is just a snippet. So you can see how specific this kind of gets, and it can be very valuable in understanding, for example, what could be driving water use in the city. For example, if you look at these uptown individuals, you see one characteristic is that they might be green and generous to environmental organizations. In these family landscapes, you have a lot of do-it-yourselfers who work on home improvement projects. You know, maybe those are people who are kind of working on their own irrigation system. So again, it's just taking these kind of general things and trying to understand how it impacts these patterns that we're looking to try and explain in cities. So again, just a little bit of background again in why we study cities and how we approach these kind of questions. So more specifically, in looking at water consumption, there have been plenty of studies that have looked at water use in cities with a lot of different findings ultimately, some very conflicting findings and some, you know, that really align. But there are some general things we see, which, for example, we tend to see that people in large and newer, more modern properties, I'm going to call them parcels throughout this, but just know it's just properties. They tend to use more water. We also tend to see the biophysical landscape. So again, you know, what's physically on the ground, trees, grass, those abiotic and biotic components. It really has a varying effect on water use. You might think that, for example, transitioning to a xeriscape is meant to help reduce water use. And in some cities, we see that it's a very effective measure to do so, but there have been other studies that have found it actually had virtually no effect on water use. And so that's why behavior again comes into play. You know, you might see that people transition to a xeriscape, but they're still not really aware of the different kind of water requirements, and they might be overwatering to get a really large cactus or something of the sort. So again, biophysical landscape really varies on how it impacts water use. We tend to see that people in homes with higher socioeconomic status tend to use more water. And then finally, again, lifestyle, watering practices really varies from city to city. An interesting piece is what's called peer effects. So how do people behave relative to the people around them? So one thing you see is that people tend to mimic their neighbors, whether that be you saw your neighbor has now a xeriscape and now you want one because it looks nice. They do look really cool. Or maybe it's that you live in an HOA, or maybe you're just on a neighborhood where everyone's kind of competing for the greenest lawn. So these things, again, really come into play. And it gets really difficult to tease out what is influencing water consumption the most, especially when you get into those kind of lifestyle, behavioral side of things. So bringing it to Fort Collins, Fort Collins is a semi-arid ecosystem. And so here, the city is very conscientious of our water use, and they're very good at it too. Like I said, I'm part of a sprinkler checkup program that, I mean, there's a lot of people in the community who are really engaged with this as well. They want to make sure they're also keeping their water bill low, but they want to make sure they're using water efficiently too. So in one of the ways, like I said, to promote water efficient landscapes is to do a xeriscape transition, which is something, you know, kind of going from a turf to this. But there are other things too. Ultimately, we just want to know, how do we reduce outdoor irrigation? And so to understand ways in which to really jump in, and whether it be outreach or you know, programs like this sprinkler checkup program that the city has, we need to understand what is driving outdoor water use currently in order to make any effective change, whether that be policy change or just you know, education. We just really need to understand what's happening on the ground. And so that was our main goal with this project. Now finally getting to the water use in Fort Collins and this particular study. So we had two main questions going into this study. The first being, referring back to those indicator variables, which ones might be driving outdoor water consumption the most, if at all? So again, looking at the morphology, the biophysical characteristics, and then those social, demographic, and lifestyle characteristics. And then we were also curious about the relationship between water use and then the percent cover of trees and grass in households. So one of the kind of trade-offs that we think about in a water sensitive city like Fort Collins is that trees do require a lot of water, and is it worth it? Is there a significant trade-off here that we have to consider, to keep our urban forest alive? I mean, we have a very vibrant urban forest here, a great urban forestry program, but we want to make sure that, again, we're being efficient with our water use. It's a very precious resource. So we primarily expected that, again, because we depend so much on water and the type of vegetation that's chosen in our urban design, that the biophysical characteristics would actually explain water consumption the most. And we also expected that trees would help actually mitigate water consumption. And we felt that for a couple of reasons. The first being that there's a physical thing happening here where that trees provide shade. You know, we all know that if you have a lawn that's shaded, you don't need to irrigate it quite as much as a lawn that's going to be exposed to high sun exposure. So that was one part to that expectation. And then we also thought that people weren't always intentionally watering their trees. I mean, you do occasionally come across that person who's like really worried about their tree dying, but overall, I think we thought that people were putting more effort in actually watering their lawn versus their trees. So here we have water use in Fort Collins. This was done for 2016. All of this is 2016 data. And you can see this is both indoor and outdoor water use. You can see on the x-axis we have January through December. On the y-axis we have the total gallons. That orange line that you see is what we call the winter quarter average. And so that's going to be, essentially it's a proxy for indoor water use. On the meters, we don't have
we can't differentiate between indoor and outdoor. So that's kind of what we use. We assume people are not watering outdoors during the winter. And so you can see how much of a spike happens in water use during the summer. I mean, I think during the summer months, we have water use at about 40% of total use. And so, or outdoor water use, I'm sorry, is about 40% of water use. And so it's a big chunk on average. And so again, this is just showing the average water use across all parcels within the water utility district. And so what we did is we wanted to look at just the peak summer months, so June through August. You can see highlighted there. And what you see highlighted there is what you see on the map on the right. This is kind of a blurred out version. I can't show you exactly, how much water each individual household uses. But you can get the gist. The areas that are darker tend to use more water. The areas that are lighter use less water. And then I will come back to this map in a little bit, so you can look at it a little bit more closely if you're interested. But then here are the variables that we looked at to try and understand water use. So again, we have our categories. And then we looked at a variety of things. By no means does this cover everything, but things like the percentage of tree cover and grass cover, temperature, this one over here, this vegetation parcel size one you see, this is a ratio. So it's essentially the amount of vegetation relative to the parcel size. And then for the morphology, we looked at things like home age, actual parcel size, how far it is from Old Town, which is kind of like what we refer to as our urban center, and direction of the front lawn. We assume people would be watering their front lawns more than their back lawns, and then a variety of social, demographic, and lifestyle variables. If you recall that little snippet I showed you was these 4 here, but we looked at a few more as well. So I am just going to jump to what we found. The variables highlighted here are the ones that tend to influence water use the most, outdoor water use the most. The difference in color you see is just their degree of impact. So the ones that are green were more impactful than the ones that were yellow. But overall, these were kind of the top ones we were able to tease out as having some kind of influence here. So tree cover, that vegetation parcel size ratio, the age of the home, the size of the parcel, how far it was from that urban center. The percentage of 3 or more people living in a household. Now that is non-family. So we are a big college town. And so we have a lot, big rental housing market. And we assume that most of those 3 or more people living together who aren't related are renters typically. And then we have home value. So going into it a little bit more, we tend to see lower water use in areas that had more tree canopy. So we got that one right. We also tend to see lower water use in areas with older homes. And then finally, 3 or more people living in a household tend to have more or lower water use. And so I'll just kind of briefly touch on why we think that is. And I will welcome plenty of conversation on this as we go on. But greater canopy cover, as I mentioned before, the tree shade I think is a huge piece here. Having tree shade is kind of critical also in a semi-arid system. It keeps it a lot cooler, slows that rate of evapotranspiration, and really just decreases the need for frequent irrigation. Older homes. So older homes tend to be located more toward that urban center where we have been urbanized the longest. We've kind of grown outward from there. And so these older homes, coincidentally, also tend to have a lot of canopy cover. And, I can't say how great their irrigation systems are or anything like that. But overall, they do tend to use more water. So that could be related to the canopy cover, could be plenty of other reasons for that. We don't know that specifically, and then finally, 3 or more person households. Again, a lot of the renter population lives near the university and kind of that urban center, like a lot of college kids, a lot of renters around that area. So again, those areas we tend to see lower water use. And then we tend to see greater water use farther from the city center. So again, as we're growing outward, particularly within the last few decades, we've really been rapidly urbanizing in the outskirts of our city. And so it might make sense that we see greater water use in those areas because people moving into those, in those newer developments, they're developing in land that was otherwise a semi-arid grassland. You know, it's pretty dry. And anyone who's moving into a household and just trying to start up their landscape is going to use a lot of water. So that could explain that. We also tend to see that households with higher socioeconomic status tend to use more water. And that also, a lot of those higher valued homes tend to be also located on the outskirts of the city, although there are, I mean, everywhere is expensive out here really, but there are some more toward the city center that are pretty expensive too. Now this was the kicker. We found that smaller parcels tended to use more water, which was kind of counterintuitive at first. You know, you'd think that the more area you have, the more water you use. But based on this work, we tended to see that smaller parcels were using more water, along with smaller patches of grass within the parcel were associated with more water use. So that was that vegetation parcel area ratio variable that we looked at. And again, so when you think about these a little bit more, the explanation that we came up with was that there's a lot of small parcels within the city, first of all, but it may just be more viable, again, to maintain an area that's smaller. You know, if you have like a small patch of grass in your yard, you're probably more likely to overwater that versus if you have, you know, vegetation in a big yard, it's probably going to take a lot of work to maintain it. And so it's, you know, we aren't exactly sure why these things are happening, but that is what we were seeing. So I just wanted to show a couple maps real quick. So here we again have the water consumption map. And next to that, here we have our tree canopy cover and grass coverage in the city. So as I mentioned in this box, this is kind of what we would call the more central part of the city. Old Town here is what we would call the urban center. This is the area that we've been inhabiting the longest. So remember, all of these trees are, you know, the prevalence of this many trees and then also the diversity, it's not going to occur naturally. So wherever we've been the longest, that's where the biggest, oldest trees are. And so you see a lot of that around here. And then as you go outward, you can see it gets a little bit sparser. And these are the areas that are more recently developed. These grass areas that you see here, we weren't able to differentiate between irrigated and non-irrigated grass with these data, but the grass that you see on the outskirts, again, this is all more of that native grassland area. So again, you can see kind of some patterns there. And then here we have the parcel size. So most of the parcels in Fort Collins are pretty small. There's not a huge bit of variation there. But again, it just kind of depends. These ones out here, these are pretty large parcels. They are single family residential. All of this is single family residential, by the way. But, you know, I can imagine it would take a lot to water some of these. You drive by and they just look like big farmland, honestly. And then here we have that ratio. Again, this was our strongest variable, that ratio of vegetation to parcel size. So the darker ones are, it's closer to a 1-to-1 ratio. So we'll say that it's almost the same amount of vegetation as it is the size of the parcel. So tiny house, for example, bigger parcel or a lot of vegetation on the parcel. Whereas you get into these smaller ones, these lighter colored ones, that's where you're gonna have smaller patches of grass and then, you know, maybe a bigger house or something like that. So I'm happy to come back to any of these maps if anybody's interested, but just moving forward. So some of the next steps that we're looking at, I'm really interested in the role of HOAs. With this sprinkler checkup program that we have, I've been learning from a lot of the customers that there's some HOAs who are really pushing for this program. for the residents to engage with this program because they want to make sure they're using water efficiently. But I've also had a couple customers that felt pushed by their HOA to maintain a green lawn. So I think it'd be really interesting to look at the effects of those and see which HOAs are kind of pushing for green where others are pushing for efficiency. Not that you can't have both, you can have both. So what is their influence and how can the city work with them to ensure more efficient water use? And then finally, can they be a tool for outreach? It appears that they've had some effectiveness with that so far. So we will see. And then finally, there was a couple of things that we did not consider that we'd like to do in the future. So what do we see with those households that have transitioned to a xeriscape? Are they actually using less water? Are they not? So that's going to be an interesting point. And then we didn't look at any specifics to like water, like amenities. So like pools, hot tubs, things like that, which definitely, I would imagine would have an influence. We have tree canopy and we cannot identify what is under the trees using that satellite imagery. So that's kind of limitation, but we assume it's grass under the trees, but doesn't have to always be the case. So that's a big thing to look into further. And then finally, are there specific species we should be looking at? Again, thinking about those more water efficient kind of vegetation choices. So that I believe is what I have for you.
Shaunie, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great week. I hope everyone else has a great week as well. And we'll see you guys next month.
Yeah, thank you all. Take care.
Bye.